thank you. Thank you for coming. This is John Houck, the artist John Houck. I'm Pedro Alonzo, and we're here to talk about John's work. I have to say I'm thrilled to be here at MACO. I haven't been in a while, and it's I can see why everyone is here. It's so much fun, and a great fair, actually. So John and I just did a show together. I curated an exhibition of his work at Dallas Contemporary. It was his first solo museum show, and but it opened around January 14th, so a week before the world changed, right? And so although I'd always looked at John's work, at your work, and thought about this kind of constructed reality, how you and all of the details, your work really demands people's attention. I had also, now with Trump lying on a daily basis and fabricating truth, it reminded me a lot of your work in the sense that your work forces us to look at it. It forces scrutiny, and it forces us to really think what is real and what isn't real. And I think that that's a really interesting metaphor for the world we're living in today. And I don't get a sense that your work is political, but it seems that now it has that very political read. Can you share some thoughts?
Yeah, that's. It could take the rest of the hour to unpack all of that, but yeah, thank you all for coming, and I'm really happy to be here. It's my second time in Mexico City, and it's such a vibrant and incredible place, and I'm really excited to be here again. But yeah, things are changing right now, and it's a very tumultuous time. And when we put the show up, this change came about, and it really made me pause in installing the show. I thought, is this too colorful? Is this not political enough? What do I do, in a sense, but the work's made and we're installing it, and I can't suddenly, change all of that and make some very direct political statement. And it's such a difficult balancing act to have a political element in one's work. And I went through the Whitney Independent Study Program, which is entirely about this idea of how one would approach including the political in artwork, particularly from a Western Marxist perspective. So I understand that very well, but that isn't exactly what my work does. I think in my case, I take a much more personal kind of approach to the political, and it comes out of a real interest in psychoanalysis, and it expands out from the personal to the kind of larger ideas from psychology and phenomenology, philosophy. I think those things really inform my work. But this idea of the kind of iteration of truth claims within each photograph is something that I think is an interesting aspect of my work, particularly in terms of truth, let's say. And so
let's just for a second describe, for those of you who may not be familiar with the work, but please go see it at On Stellar Rays. There are shadows. There's layering. Can you talk a bit about the work as well,
Sure.
just so people get a sense of the specific characteristics?
So it really started with this project that I started when I was in the Whitney program in 2009-2010 called The Aggregates. And there are these combinatorial grids that I was generating with software, and I would fold the paper, photograph it, print that out, and then take another photograph of it. And it started this kind of iterative process of re-photographing. And then that slowly turned into this other project, the History of Graph paper, where instead of re-photographing grids with folded paper, I started taking objects from my family, basically, that they were giving me, like my stamp collection, my baseball cards, all things that they started to give me once they found out I was in psychoanalysis 3 days a week and living in New York. It was kind of our way of working on me becoming psychically free of them, and they were giving me these things from my childhood, I think, as a way to say, get this stuff out of our house, don't forget you are our child, these objects prove our connection, but now they're yours. And so I was rephotographing those and thinking about, in analysis, the kind of idea that to remember something, reminiscence, is an imaginative act. It's not like pulling up a file on a computer and the thing is the same way as you left it. Every time you remember something, it continually sort of shifts. And so in the photographs, particularly with the historiograph paper, that kind of unstable ground of memory figures in terms of the objects being rephotographed. So like I'll take a photo of my baseball card collection, print it out at the same scale as the actual cards in real life, lay the cards back on top of a photo of themselves, and that has created this kind of iterative way of working photographically. And now, recently with your show, there was a real push to start painting as part of the process of the rephotographing, as a way to kind of undermine the fidelity of photography.
Well, and that's interesting too, because if in terms of memory, the way we remember things is very different, and facts now, the same data can be spun totally differently. If you listen to something on CNN or Fox News, it can be the same data, but you get a totally different bent on it. And I think your work relates to that as well.
Mm-hmm. But in a sense, I think that is the issue in a way, is that kind of idea. Well, there's this John Cheever quote that I'm thinking of in particular, where he says, "I lie to tell a more significant truth." And he's an author, and this is something that an author, an artist can do, of course, and should be doing. And it's a kind of discipline where vulnerability is encouraged. But when it comes to like going to see a doctor, I don't want a vulnerable doctor. And I don't want my politicians to be artists. I don't want them to be manufacturing multiple truth claims, in a sense. I want them to be adhering to a kind of rationality. And I think that's where we've gone so astray. I think everybody, I mean, this is maybe a plain way to put it, but everybody wants to be an artist or something, and I don't want a creative politician in that way, or even in finance, you know, like so many things have gone astray because of so-called innovation, financial innovation with derivatives and such. But really, you know, I just watched the Warren Buffett documentary, The Oracle of Omaha, and he is so uncreative in a sense, but he's a brilliant investor because of this. He's not trying to be an artist, and I think there needs to be a kind of separation between disciplines, and we bring something different, and that's where the world is getting so confusing and fractured, and it has to do with technology as well, of course. But
well, and two things. In a way, you know, when we look at your aggregates, which is basically computer code, the product of computer code, and it's very much science, it's very much about math and precision, but then you tweak it, right? You hack it, you fold it, and you rephotograph it, and you fold it again, and I think that well, that again makes me think about, you know, facts and how they're played with continually. You know, but these weren't really your intentions. But this is, how do you feel about this read to your work at this time?
Yeah, I think it is. It is an interesting read. I've got it many times in studio visits. Like, the thing that happens in my photographs is that you question what is real in a photograph, and that's an odd thing, because we typically look at a photograph, and as Roland Barthes says, there's that quality of that has been, and we know that that was a thing in time that existed, a moment, an event. Mm-hmm. But in my photographs, there are multiple events piled one on top of the other, and that confusion, for me, is a way, initially my real thought was to encourage a deep form of attention on the part of the viewer. Yeah. So you look at the photo, you glance at it, and you think, I know what that photograph is, and it's simple. But as you look at it, it unfolds in a way where it encourages your kind of absorption in the process of viewing. And to me, that's a political act, to encourage that kind of visual acuity and attention, and particularly in a world where, you know, there are 1 billion new photographs a day being made on Instagram, all this kind of thing. Like, how do you kind of resist that very quick read and encourage something to be very layered? And so the constructedness was a way to talk about how images are constructed and encourage a kind of attention. And that's why I don't go too far and rephotograph it like 20 times, because then it becomes just a sort of spectacle.
Yeah, and well, there's this, you know, you don't take photographs, you make them. Mm-hmm. You are really constructing a reality, and in some ways it's very personal, John, there's a piece in the show in Dallas where there's a little driftwood log that used to adorn their house. And I just thought it would just be very funny, with your wife coming home one day, like, where the hell is it? And then you put it into a work, you took it to the studio, I think that construction, and there's that very personal human side to your work that I really, that I love. I think it's great.
Yeah, and that's, that really, just to go back to that log, because it is kind of interesting. My wife and I recently had a child, and my wife set up a fertility altar in the house, and I became kind of obsessed with the altar in a way, and I started taking objects and putting them into photographs, and I made paintings of the altar as well. There's like 5 different paintings that I've never shown, and so there's, the kind of fabric of my world. Relations are very important to me. I have a particular interest in relational psychoanalysis, so very briefly, Freud, had the drive theory. He says that we do these things unconsciously because of the death drive and our libido, and everything kind of gets boiled down to a sexual kind of drive. But then in the 40s and 50s, psychoanalysts started to come up with this idea that no, in fact, what that drive theory leaves out is the fact that we're related to other people, and that is what kind of drives us in the world, and things happen because of that relatedness in the world. And the analyst I see is of that school, and there's this particular analyst, Donald Winnicott, who's my absolute favorite, and his entire idea is that health equals spontaneity and intuition, and that play, when we're playing as a child or as an adult, that's when we're most fully alive. And so it's a long way of saying that I really try to, in the early work, the aggregates, there was a kind of systematic nature to them, and I think that was coming out of my experience in software. But as I've gone now 8 years in psychoanalysis, the work I think has become more playful and personal, largely because of that process of psychoanalysis. And the fold was the first kind of playful move, the first way to rupture the surface of the photograph, and now that's expanded in terms of its paint on top of the surface.
Well, it's your journey as an artist, as a human, as an artist is fascinating, because there's this underlying tension between rational mathematical thought and intuitive playfulness. And it was, you studied computer science, and you say, I love when you talk about how one day you realized you were just lonely.
Yes.
And you wanted to do something that was more about humanity and people, and which led you to architecture. But even as an artist, your initial approach involved code and was very rational, and you had to break out of that.
I did. It's been a kind of my struggle in some sense, is breaking out of rationality in a way. And also, I think the other component of that is I was raised in Colorado, in a very rural area, in a part of the U.S. where this kind of idea of rugged individualism is very strong. So it's antithetical to relational psychoanalysis. It's the exact opposite. It's the idea that you don't need anybody. It's the illusion that you could live your life without depending on a single person.
Alone in a cave.
Exactly.
With a goat. Yeah.
So I was coming from that perspective, and then working in software, which is even more kind of isolating. So I was a mess. I needed psychoanalysis to kind of, and it brought me out of my shell in a sense, in many ways, but that's the kind of area I was coming from, and so the aggregates made a lot of sense for me, and they still do. I don't think that, at first when I started exploring these ideas, I was like, well, I'm going to become like Paul McCarthy and start making a mess in the studio and be just expressive constantly, but really, that's not who I am, and there is this side of me that is very rational. I just think it's kind of shifted now to more kind of playfulness in the work, but also there's still this element of technical repetition that I think is important, and it acts as a kind of ground with which the more playful things can even be amplified in a way.
Yeah, well, and the mechanisms that you've developed in order to break with the sort of the rationality. Every morning, you while reading the New York Times, you start to draw, and then you had this fascination with painting that you developed in Skowhegan, and it was almost like a love affair, like a secret love affair. You was there. You talk about John talks about stirring paint to help him calm down, and the appreciation for the messiness of painting, and so these were exercises that you sort of fell upon, developed.
I think as you're describing it, I remember there's this book by the poet Mary Oliver called a guidebook to poetry, and it's a poetry guidebook, but it's just an incredible book about her method, and in there she's talking about how she uses the peripatetic method, and she walks as she writes her poems, and things come to her, and she gets into this trance-like, dreamlike state as she's making her work. And it's this idea that you can't will artwork into existence, and coming from, because I also grew up cycling and ski racing and training in that way, you can be very goal-oriented and sort of direct your attention and get somewhere with things. But with making art, it's like you just have to show up and hope that the piece emerges, in a sense. And that was a very different sensibility for me, to kind of trust that what was coming to my mind was something that I could follow, even if it was a really difficult emotion or thought, and to kind of see it through rather than falling back on something that's more rational.
So you had to learn to stop programming in a way.
I did.
And sort of lay it all out and think about it, and just sort of run with it.
Yeah.
Let your mind guide you.
Yeah, it's really the process of free association in a way, which is, if you compare that to programming, in programming you're using what's called a formal language. So there's a very set of words, a finite set of words. They're all about precision. You can only use them in a particular way. And when you program 10 hours a day, speaking that language, so to speak, with the machine, it starts to color the way you think about the entire world. So when I was in analysis and free association, that's an entirely different language. It uses natural language. It's all about subtlety and connotation and saying whatever comes to your mind. That is, again, the kind of opposite. And so that was a way, and I always say this in interviews, it was more important to me than going through grad school, in a sense, was that work of free association and allowing myself to, again, trust the kind of nonsense that comes out in the studio and to see where it goes, because it is so easy to, once you have an emotion, to step back and go to things that are more comforting, like programming, things that are highly repeatable. Those things are really comforting, because you always have a correct answer.
Yeah, and you were working at Sun Microsystems, so this was, you had like a real job in an exploding field. And but what I think is very funny, you mentioned once that when you showed up to psychoanalysis for the first time, you brought a pen and notebook, and you were like ready to take notes.
I was. That was my way of distancing myself from having any emotion. Yet another defense mechanism was taking lots of notes. I've since shed that.
Did it take a while for you to leave the notebook at home?
It took a while.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, not in analysis, they wouldn't let me take the notebook at some point, but in life in general, yeah.
Wow.
And that's always why art talks are so great, because you don't like to over prepare, and that is a good practice for me.
Good. Don't tell them that.
No.
I have a cheat sheet right here. I prepared over tacos. One of the we were talking about this earlier. I was with the photographer Vic Muniz a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about your work. And Vic was really impressed that, he's like, that guy, and you did a show, he really likes your work. But then he asked me, he assumed, he referred to you as a post-Photoshop artist. And when I told him, I said, Vic, he doesn't use Photoshop. I mean, he really constructs these scenes and photographs them. And so in a way, you are post Photoshop, because you really don't even use it. Yeah. And that's a big decision, because a lot of your colleagues do. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a bit about that? Because, with just in a sec, if you think about, the photography liberated painting from representation, and in a way Photoshop liberated photography from representation, right? Because you just make whatever you want. But you don't use that. You have a totally different approach.
Yeah, I think I was always suspect of Photoshop in a sense because, as you mentioned, a lot of my peers were using it, and I wanted to kind of find a different way. And I think studying architecture, we used to build models and photograph them, and that kind of became my working method. And I think what that allows is a kind of, it opens up the work to the contingencies of materiality, which Photoshop you lose. It's all kind of virtual and within the computer, and I always thought if I'm going to use the computer in my work, it's going to be something like the aggregates. It's, as they say in software, it's going to be closer to the metal, which means you're using a really low-level language to do something really difficult, rather than a really high-level thing like Photoshop, where there's no coding involved. You're just operating at a very sort of high-level, surface kind of level. And I think if I'm going to make
using an application,
it is,
yeah.
and I don't think that's interesting.
Yeah.
Like, no, you don't see writers saying, okay, I use Microsoft Word and I'm going to make my entire novel about Microsoft Word. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's a tool in a sense. And so I thought, why are we holding up Photoshop as a kind of important tool or thing to interrogate? I'd rather interrogate computation in a sense.
Yeah.
That's in the case of the aggregates. And then I think I'd rather interrogate the kind of feedback loop of visual culture in terms of the way that I rephotograph, and setting it up in a physical way, because there are just things that happen in front of the camera that can't happen in Photoshop.
Sure, sure, and actually the feedback loop is a really important aspect of your work, because there's this constant recycling of imagery, and you print, and then you photograph the print, and then you cut it up and use it again later. So can you elaborate a bit on the feedback loop and how your images kind of cross-pollinate, and then we can get into painting again.
Yeah, so like in grad school, I was kind of split in two in a way. I was making interactive installations, and then I was also making 4x5 photos out in the world, kind of like after the new topographic school of photography. And it just didn't seem to suit me. Once I left grad school, I realized, again, I think this is from architecture, I had a real interest in building things up in layers. Like in architecture, you make a presentation board for your building, and you can put drawings, you can put photographs, you can put painting, you can write text, and it's all in one sort of presentation. And then when I got to art, it was also precious, like, oh, you have to be a photographer or a painter, and these have to remain sort of separate. And so the kind of idea of a presentation board allowed me to think about layering. And once I started rephotographing my photos, it opened up this world where no longer was photography limited to a kind of monocular vision and a single event in time. It could be like painting, and it could do that thing where on each successive photograph, as I'm rephotographing something, I'll change the perspective of the cameras, and I'll change the direction of the light, so there can be multiple light sources, there can be multiple perspectives. And to me, again, that's like the way in which we remember things, our kind of mind's eye in terms of memory is, you know, we remember different every time we remember it, and it's from different angles. And I've become very interested in, this is really simple, but the idea that, like, when you think about a memory, you imagine, if you're thinking about yourself in a room, let's say, you imagine a bird's eye view of you looking down at yourself in the room, but in the actual event that took place, you were the person sitting there looking out. So there's this real disjunctive quality already in terms of memory, because you're looking outside of yourself, looking in. So I've been thinking a lot about, like, what would it be like to be able to depict something as a memory that would be from your perspective in that event, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, and is that what led to the layered pieces you're taking that you create kind of so John's been doing this newer body of work where he uses architectural tools for drying.
For blueprint storage.
Blueprint storage. And he hangs different objects and prints in 3D, right? And you photograph it, and it, obviously the photographs as a flat surface. Is that where that's coming from?
It was getting at that a bit, yeah. And also yet another way, so there's a kind of repetition within the photograph, but then when I have a show, I'd like there to be a repetition among the pieces as well. So you might see a jar that I photographed in one photo, and then you see a different iteration of that jar in another photograph, in those larger hanging paper pieces. Yeah.
We had a lot of boats in Dallas.
There were a lot of boats.
We had a lot of boats.
I don't know how that came about.
And that was a friend of yours who gave you the boat.
Yeah, it was the very first person I worked with in software. This guy Justin, and he now lives on a yacht. He did very well in software, I guess. So he gave me a boat. I don't know if he's rubbing it in, but, but it was that really was a photo about him. But he was a really important person to me because my first day on the job, they gave us this JavaScript quiz, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I like BS'd myself through the interview, and I got this incredible job, and they gave us this quiz, and he basically let me, copy his results, and then I, slowly learned to program better as I worked there. But it was just one of those moments where, like, I may have not worked in software had it not been for Justin. He really, maybe I would have, I don't know. But that was a really important moment. So yeah.
And now he's on a yacht.
Yeah. He's done with it.
I wanted to talk about Mexico. You keep telling me how good everything is. The mezcal is better and the margaritas. But this is your second or third trip here?
Second time.
Second time. So John was actually born. He grew up in Colorado, but he was born on a reservation. So in the United States, the Native American, the indigenous people, los indígenas, were displaced and basically put on reservations in really remote, unwanted parts of the country, like the equivalent of the deserts of Sonora. And and something struck me when we were talking about Mexico, that when you got here, you said, "Oh my God, like this is what the United States would have been like had there been a real integration of cultures as opposed to a total displacement of culture." So I just would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, completely.
For our largely Mexican audience.
Yeah, so I was born in South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation. My dad was involved with the American Indian movement. I'm not Lakota Sioux, but he got interested in the American Indian movement and moved our family there. He's retired now, but he was a public school teacher, and his first job was on the reservation, and we only stayed 3 years because he kind of got in hot water with the FBI, and they were like, "What is this white person doing on the reservation?" And so we left. But we would always host families when they would come to Denver to do the powwow, and we would go back to the reservation every year. It was a really formative part of my upbringing. But as Pedro is saying, it's the reservation is completely isolated. And
it's one of the poorest parts of the United States.
It's the poorest part of the United States, yes. And we think about, of course, borders are so much in the news right now. Around the United States, but we never talk about in the U.S. about there are borders within it. There are these reservations that are somewhat autonomous regions, and there are very distinct borders between the reservation and the rest of the United States. You go to the grocery store on the reservation, and they have nothing but white cans of food with just a black label on it. Commodities from the U.S. government. It's a really difficult and destitute kind of place.
And for many years they were seen as another nation, and there are treaties with them. I mean, there was the Bureau of Indian Affairs that dealt with the Native Americans, so it's totally separate. Unlike here, where it's very integrated.
And that was, I think, when I first visited, I was amazed that the native cultures just feel so much more integrated into the culture of Mexico and makes it such a vibrant place. And that's just not the case in the U.S. And it really was heartbreaking in a way to see what perhaps could have been in the U.S. And to think about, nobody really leaves the reservation either. It's quite rare, and it just remains a very isolated place. At least Pine Ridge, other reservations might be slightly different, but also my dad taught middle school, and he taught geography and social studies, and his particular interest was Mayan and Aztec cultures. So that was, to hear all these stories and creation myths from the Aztecs and the Mayans, and to actually come here finally was a revelation.
Oh, I had no idea.
And we were here on the summer solstice and went out to Teotihuacan, and it just, it's
I should have, and I was trying to tell him something in the Museo de Antropología. I should have been asking you.
No, I was learning a lot. It was very good.
Wow, so you came during the summer solstice?
Yeah, not on purpose. We just happened to be there on that day. Yeah.
Wow. I've never been to a reservation, and the idea, the way the two countries went through the process of colonization is quite opposite, right? I mean, there was this process of hybridization that defines the sort of the unification of Mesoamerican European culture, and in the United States, it's always been, marginalized and distanced and abused and forgotten.
Yeah. I know, and it's like the reservation. President Clinton tried to bring a technology hub there and create Wi-Fi for the entire Pine Ridge Reservation, and it just, these things, nothing has kind of changed there. And the other thing is, there's no money because nobody lives nearby either. To, like, if they had casinos, then there's nobody to even come. There's like one casino, and it's in like a double wide trailer.
Oh, really?
In Rosebud. It's very isolated geographically. So that gives you a sense of, where, because before that, the Lakota Sioux had the Black Hills. They had, a large portion of the United States where they lived.
Wow, I'm just thinking about, this, how what I feel is a very kind of cultural struggle in the United States to deal with the past. The Native American, African American, slavery. I live in Boston, where people are very quick to point out how it was the first state to abolish slavery. What no one ever mentions, it was also the first state to legalize slavery. So, and I think that this idea, in a way, it's kind of like a metaphor for just hiding it and forgetting about it.
Yeah.
Not dealing with it. And then back to your work, I think that, I'm very moved, because it was one thing to sort of think that, Trump was coming, but after 3 weeks of Trump, I mean, he's really here. And it's interesting to think about your work in the sense that I see it reminds me, it makes me think about our responsibility as living in a democracy, right? And how we can't take these things for granted, and we really have to scrutinize. But in the sense of psychoanalysis and psychology, there's also this idea of cognitive dissonance, where just people's actions don't make sense, and that kind of constructed reality of yours that doesn't make sense. So I don't know. I hope I'm not reading too much into this, but that's what I'm seeing in your work more now than ever before, January 20th.
Yeah, what to say about that? I mean, because there has been a lot written in terms of like social realism and the fact that photography, because it can make a truth claim, should make one. And the ideas about documentary, those could also be seen as quite political. But I think to me there's something important to express in terms of repetition, technical repetition. And that's where the rephotographing is important. I think that is a kind of realism, in a sense, for the times we live in. And I want to explore how desire could be formed within the realm of a very repetitive kind of world, very fractured kind of world. How do we kind of break that? And I mean, very simply, the fold was a way, as we were pointing out, to break with the kind of rationality of the aggregate, a way to interrupt it, and a way to assert some kind of subjectivity. And then in my later work, it was, that kind of personal turn was another way to insert something more subjective and not make kind of abject or cynical work. I think I, have a real interest in as you know, David Foster Wallace theorized a lot, the idea of being earnest versus being cynical. I think I definitely fall much more toward the earnest side of things, and that, for me, again, is a way to make work that I think has political implications.
Yeah, and without ramming it down our throat, because many people could just look at the work and think of it from a very different perspective without the politics. And I think, I keep telling people that this is a great time for comedy, psychoanalysis, and art, right? And I think that it's interesting, because we've been working together now for several years and talking a lot, and these things, although I wouldn't say were never addressed or discussed, now it is clearly evident and in your face, right? Without being a Shepherd Ferry with a slogan on it.
Yeah. No, it's really curious. I mean, in the Whitney, I was really taken with this political theorist Chantal Mouffe and her ideas about agonism, that if we can turn antagonism into what she calls agonism, that's where political change can happen. And what I love about her work is that she says we already have a great system in the United States, and it's not about taking it apart, it's much more about continuing it and continuing to build it. And I think that's where
equity,
exactly, and that's where art is so important. I think we're not in this stage of I'm not, at least, of tearing everything down. I think what the Trump administration doing is, in a sense, unfortunately, terribly easy. It's much easier to take things apart than it is to build things, and that's what they're doing. And I think we need to acknowledge that the system is very good and it has really good qualities, and how do we keep it in place and continue to build it. And I hope that artists, rather than taking the tact of futurism and tearing things apart and going to war, actually continue to build and show us new ways of feeling and getting at things that are perhaps unconscious or not really known, and exposing that kind of thing and making it visible.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's very important that it is art, and there's this plurality of forms of expression and of artists and practices, and it doesn't all have to be the same, right? I think that the statements you make in your work are extremely important, and help us think differently about our reality, including memory. And so we'll open it up for questions. One last thing was the painting. In Dallas, John presented painting for the first time, and they weren't hung next to the photo-based work. They were hung, we call it the sandwich, but they were hung back to back, floating, suspended in midair. And there's this, again, the feedback loop, because the images from the photos feed the painting and vice versa. Can you just chat a little bit about the paintings?
Yeah, for the photographs, I often make drawings or paintings as a kind of sketch for the photograph. They're so layered, the photos, that it helps me to kind of figure out how I want to make the photograph, which I like in the sense that it's a kind of inversion. Typically painting uses photographic sources, and here I'm kind of flipping that around. And I have been painting for a while and always wanted to kind of include them in the show, but I didn't want them to be sort of across the room from one another, so you could glance at the photo and then the corresponding painting. Pedro and I had this idea to kind of separate them architecturally, so they're on panels on the sandwich in the middle of the space, and the idea is you see the painting and then you walk over and you see the photo, and you have to hold them in your mind and kind of make the comparison. And again, for me, it's really about encouraging people to look in a particular way and to remember. I think there's such because of technology and alternate facts and all of this sort of thing, memory becomes even more important. That's all psychoanalysis is, in some sense, is remembering with feeling.
Yeah.
And now people aren't even really reminiscing at all. With technology as a way to externalize our memories, it's become very sophisticated to the point where we don't have to remember a whole lot. And I think that's a real danger for a democracy, for any kind of world. And so in my work, in a small way, I'm trying to encourage people to reminisce.
Yeah, no, that's lovely, because I keep thinking, as you were speaking about this, I kept thinking about curiosity, right? And your work, you know, really demands curiosity. It forces you to come up and look and explore the surface and the artwork. I'd like to open it up. Does anyone have a question for John? No questions? All right, well, anything else you want to, before we...
No, that sounds good.
Yeah, that sounds
Thanks,
good.
Pedro.
All right, no, thank you, John.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure.
Same.